On Friday, October 13th, 1307, before sunrise, sealed royal orders opened across France. Not in one city, not in one fortress, everywhere. Men who had worn the white mantle of the temple, warriors, monks, bankers, guardians of kings, were dragged from their beds and placed under arrest. Their houses were seized. Their papers were taken. Their reputation, built over nearly 2 centuries, began to collapse in a single morning. It was not just a raid. It was a message. And once that message was delivered, Europe would never look at the Knights Templar the same way again. The story begins in darkness, but not the kind that belongs only to legend. This was political darkness, legal darkness, the darkness of documents prepared in advance, of officials waiting for the right hour, of a king who understood that power is most effective when it arrives before anyone has time to resist. For centuries, people have looked back at that date, Friday the 13th, and seen an omen. A cursed number, a cursed day, a perfect stage for betrayal. But history is rarely that neat. The real story is more unsettling, because it does not depend on superstition. It depends on debt, fear, ambition, and the careful destruction of an institution that had become too wealthy, too independent, and perhaps too useful to be allowed to survive. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Because this is not simply the fall of a medieval order. It is the story of how accusation can become weapon, how confession can be forced into existence, and how one cold morning in France became attached to one of the most enduring legends in the Western imagination. The Templars did not vanish in battle. They were not defeated by an army on the field. They were taken by paperwork, prison doors, and royal command. And that is where the legend truly begins. Before the soldiers came for the temple, the date already carried a strange weight. Friday had long lived uneasily inside the Christian imagination. It was the day associated with the crucifixion, a day of execution, grief, and divine suffering. That alone did not make every Friday unlucky, of course. Medieval people still worked, traded, married, traveled, and made ordinary mistakes on Fridays like everyone else. But symbols have a way of collecting emotion. A day tied to sacred death could never be entirely innocent. Then there was the number 13. In Christian tradition, it sat close to the Last Supper, where 13 figures gathered before betrayal entered the room. In later European folklore, 13 became the awkward guest at the table, the number that did not fit cleanly into a world that preferred 12s. 12 apostles, 12 months, 12 signs, 12 hours. 12 felt complete. 13 seemed to step one pace beyond order. That does not mean everyone in the Middle Ages trembled whenever the number appeared. History is more stubborn than that. Superstition did not move evenly across Europe, and the fear of Friday the 13th as a single combined curse appears to have grown much later than the Templar arrests. The date was not necessarily circled in red by medieval peasants as a day of disaster. And yet, when a catastrophe does happen on a date already rich with symbolic unease, memory begins to do what memory always does. It arranges, it sharpens, it finds patterns where official records only show decisions. Some writers have tried to push the fear of 13 further back, into ancient Mesopotamia, connecting it to Sumerian belief, or even to the Code of Hammurabi. Those claims should be handled carefully, needs verification. They appear often in popular retellings, but repetition is not the same as evidence. A story can sound ancient simply because it has been told in a deep voice often enough. What we can say with more confidence is this. By the time later generations looked back at October 13th, 1307, the date felt almost too perfect for the crime they believed had occurred. A Friday, a 13th, a hidden command, a religious order destroyed before dawn. The danger is assuming the date created the event. It did not. King Philip's officials did not need a curse to open their sealed orders. They needed authorization, planning, and a political reason strong enough to justify striking one of the most famous Christian brotherhoods in Europe. That is what makes the date so powerful. Not because the stars demanded it, not because numbers secretly moved the king's hand, but because ordinary human motives, debt, suspicion, control, happened to arrive dressed in a costume superstition already knew how to recognize. And once people saw the costume, they never quite forgot it. The men arrested in 1307 did not begin as bankers, landowners, or political enemies of a king. They began, at least in the story they told about themselves, with roads. Not grand roads lined with banners and ceremony, but difficult roads. Roads cut through heat, dust, fear, and uncertainty. After the First Crusade, when Christian forces captured Jerusalem in 1099, pilgrims from Western Europe began traveling in larger numbers toward the holy places they had heard about all their lives. For many of them, this was not tourism in any modern sense. It was devotion made physical, a journey of repentance, hope, and danger. The problem was simple. A pilgrim could survive the sea crossing, reach the eastern Mediterranean, and still be robbed, attacked, or killed before reaching Jerusalem. Around 1118, a small group of knights formed a brotherhood dedicated to protecting those travelers. Tradition places Hugh of Paynes among their founders, though the early details are not as clean as later legend would prefer. Their first mission was narrow, practical, almost modest, guard pilgrims on the roads of the Holy Land, and yet the idea behind them was anything but ordinary. A knight was supposed to fight. A monk was supposed to renounce the world. Medieval Europe understood both roles, but it did not naturally expect them to live inside the same body. The Templars stood at that strange meeting point. They took religious vows. They lived under discipline. They were expected to practice obedience, poverty, and chastity, but they also carried swords, wore armor, and trained for violence. To modern ears, that combination can sound contradictory. To the 12th century, it was disturbing, inspiring, and useful all at once. The Templar was not merely a soldier who prayed before battle. He was supposed to be something more severe, a man whose violence had been placed under sacred command. That was the theory, at least. And theories matter, especially when they allow a society to reconcile two things it desperately wants to keep separate: holiness and bloodshed. Their name came from the place associated with their early headquarters, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. That location gave them more than a title. It gave them atmosphere. To Europeans far away, the idea of armed monks stationed near the site of the ancient temple carried a force no ordinary military company could match. They were not just guards. They seemed to stand at the center of biblical history itself. This is one reason the Templars became so compelling so quickly. Their identity was almost perfectly designed for an age of crusade. They offered nobles a way to support holy war without always leaving home. They offered younger sons of aristocratic families a disciplined vocation that was not quite monastery and not quite battlefield, but somehow both. They offered the church a fighting instrument wrapped in religious language. But there was a cost hidden inside that brilliance. Once a warrior claims sacred purpose, criticism becomes more dangerous. Once a military order becomes a religious order, ordinary failure can begin to look like spiritual corruption. And once a group builds its reputation on purity, obedience, and divine mission, any accusation against that purity will land with unusual force. That would matter later. For now, the first Templars were still few in number, still dependent on support, still far from the vast network they would one day command. It is easy, knowing how the story ends, to imagine them as powerful from the beginning. But power usually starts smaller than legend allows. It begins with a need, then a promise, then a few people willing to believe the promise. On the roads to Jerusalem, the promise was protection. A pilgrim walking under a hard sun did not care about the future financial architecture of Europe. He cared about reaching the holy city alive. The white mantle, the red cross, the disciplined horsemen on the road. These were not yet symbols of scandal. They were reassurance. That is the first thing to remember about the Knights Templar. Before they became an object of suspicion, they were an answer to fear. The growth of the Knights Templar was not sudden, in the way a fire is sudden. It was closer to the raising of a fortress, stone by stone, gift by gift, privilege by privilege, until people looked up and realized that something enormous now stood where a small brotherhood had once been. In the early years, the Templars needed legitimacy almost as much as they needed men. A handful of armed pilgrims could call themselves defenders of the road, but Europe had many armed men and many religious dreamers. What the Templars required was recognition, the kind that turned a local experiment into an institution. They received it. Church approval gave the order a spiritual seriousness that ordinary knighthood could not claim. Noble support gave it land, recruits, and reputation. Preachers praised the idea of the monk knight as a new kind of Christian warrior, not fighting for personal glory, not raiding for private gain, but serving a mission larger than himself. Or whether every individual Templar lived up to that image is another question. Institutions often survive by advertising their ideal self, not their daily reality. But the ideal was powerful. To a noble family in France, England, Aragon, or Italy, supporting the Templars could mean many things at once. It was piety. It was politics. It was a way to participate in the defense of the Holy Land without personally crossing the sea. A lord could donate land, money, horses, mills, or rights of income, and feel that he had placed part of his fortune in the service of God. The Templars understood how to receive such gifts. More importantly, they understood how to preserve them. This is where the order begins to change shape. The men on horseback were still important, but behind every knight in the east stood a much larger machine in the west. Farms had to be managed, rents collected, horses bred, ships supplied, armor purchased, letters carried, accounts kept. The crusading frontier may have provided the drama, but administration provided the endurance. That is easy to underestimate. A medieval army could inspire awe for a season. A disciplined bureaucracy could survive generations. The Templars became respected not only because they could fight, but because they could organize. They built commanderies across Europe, local houses that served as estates, recruitment centers, storage points, and financial hubs. These places were not always grand castles. Some were working properties, tied to fields, barns, chapels, and ledgers. The romance of the Templars often prefers the sword. The real power of the order may have rested just as much in the account book. And because they answered ultimately to the Pope rather than to local kings or bishops, they occupied an unusual position. They lived inside kingdoms, held property inside kingdoms, moved money through kingdoms, but they did not belong fully to the rulers of those kingdoms. At first, that independence looked like protection. Later, it would look like a problem. By the 13th century, the Templars had become one of the most recognizable institutions in Christendom. Their red cross was more than a badge. It was a signal of discipline, sacrifice, and access. Kings dealt with them. Nobles trusted them. Pilgrims feared the journey less when the temple's name was attached to protection. In an age where distance made everything fragile, the order became a rare structure that could connect faraway places with something like reliability. That kind of reputation does not remain innocent. Respect and fear often grow from the same root. The more capable the Templars appeared, the more questions gathered around them. How much wealth did they truly control? What did they do behind closed doors? How could men sworn to poverty become guardians of treasure? How could servants of the church become so deeply entangled with kings, loans, castles, and war? Some of these questions were reasonable. Some were jealous. Some were born from the simple human suspicion that any secretive and powerful group must be hiding something. The Templars did not help themselves by being exclusive, disciplined, and largely answerable to authorities beyond local reach. In a world of visible hierarchies, they were both everywhere and strangely apart. That apartness is crucial. The order's strength was not merely military, it was institutional. The Templars had rules, property, international connections, papal privileges, and a shared identity strong enough to survive across borders. A French Templar and an English Templar might serve different kingdoms by birth, but the order gave them another loyalty, one that did not map neatly onto royal ambition. For most of their history, this made them useful. When crusading energy remained strong, the Templars could be celebrated as defenders of the faith. When rulers needed reliable agents, they could be trusted with money and logistics. When nobles worried about their souls, a donation to the temple seemed like a respectable investment in eternity. But institutions do not control the meaning of their own reputation forever. The same qualities that once made the Templars admirable could be turned against them. Their discipline could be described as secrecy. Their wealth could be described as greed. Their independence could be described as arrogance. Their rituals could be described as hidden corruption. Their loyalty to the Pope could be described by a hostile king as disloyalty to the crown. Nothing had to change inside the order for the story about the order to change. That is one of the quiet lessons of their rise. Power is not only what you possess, it is also what others believe you possess. By the early 1300s, the Templars had become large enough that rumor could cling to them. They had become famous enough that accusation would travel quickly. They had become wealthy enough that destruction might look profitable. The little brotherhood of pilgrim guards had succeeded beyond anything its founders likely imagined. And success, in medieval politics, could be a dangerous form of exposure. By the time the Templars became powerful, their world was no longer made only of saddles, swords, and pilgrim roads. It was made of buildings, a house in Champagne, a mill in England, a vineyard in Provence, a chapel in Portugal, a fortified commandery watching over a road, a storehouse near a port where grain, horses, armor, and coin could be gathered before moving east. The order's power was not hidden in one legendary vault beneath Jerusalem, whatever later imaginations might prefer. It was scattered, practical, and deeply embedded in the ordinary economy of medieval Europe. That is less romantic than buried treasure. It is also more important. The Templars became rich not because they discovered a secret beyond human understanding, but because generations of Europeans gave them things. Kings gave, counts gave, widows gave, dying men gave. Families with land gave portions of it away in return for prayers, prestige, or the hope that their property might serve a sacred cause. Some donors were sincere. Some were calculating. Most were probably a little of both, because medieval piety and medieval self-interest were not enemies. They often rode in the same cart. A nobleman might give land to the temple because he truly believed in the defense of the Holy Land. He might also do it because the act improved his reputation, tied his family to an admired institution, or helped arrange the spiritual bookkeeping of his final years. Death was not an abstract idea in the Middle Ages. It was near, public, and theologically serious. To give to a religious order was, for many, a way of preparing for the judgment they had been taught to expect. The Templars accepted these gifts and turned them into a system. A donated field was not just a field. Properly managed, it produced rents, crops, wool, or income. A mill was not just a building beside water. It could generate regular revenue from those who needed grain ground. A herd of animals could support military operations far away. A house in one region could send surplus toward another. Piece by piece, the order created a network that could gather wealth from the west and direct it toward its mission in the east. This is where the legend of Templar wealth becomes complicated. Yes, they held enormous property. Yes, they handled treasure. Yes, rulers and nobles entrusted them with money, but they were not wealthy in the simple sense of a dragon sitting on gold for pleasure. Their wealth was institutional. It had obligations attached to it. Castles to supply, brothers to feed, horses to maintain, ships to hire, fortresses to repair, prisoners to ransom, campaigns to fund. Medieval war was expensive even when dressed in holy language, especially then, perhaps. Still, money changes how people are seen. The vow of poverty belonged to the individual brother. A Templar knight was not supposed to own personal riches, but the order itself could own vast resources. That distinction made sense within the religious logic of the time, but it was also easy to misunderstand, and even easier to attack. To critics, it could look like a clever loophole, poor men inside an immensely rich machine. The Templars also became trusted financial agents, and this is one of the most misunderstood parts of their story. They were not bankers in the modern sense, with glass offices, interest rates printed in small font, and someone trying to sell you a terrible account upgrade. But they did develop services that made them valuable in a dangerous world. They could hold deposits. They could transfer value across distance. A person could place funds with the order in one region and draw on resources elsewhere through written arrangements. Kings used them. Nobles used them. Pilgrims used them. In a Europe where roads were unsafe and carrying large amounts of coin could make a traveler very memorable to the wrong sort of people. This mattered. Trust became a form of infrastructure. The Templars had houses across borders. They had disciplined personnel. They had records. They had a reputation for seriousness. These things allowed them to do what many others could not: move value without always moving metal. That did not make them magical financiers. It made them competent, connected, and unusually reliable. Reliability can become its own kind of power. Think of what that meant for a king. A ruler might need money secured, debts managed, taxes collected, or treasure stored. The Templars could help, but every time a king leaned on them, he also revealed something uncomfortable: that this religious order possessed capacities the crown itself did not always command. They had reach. They had credit. They had trained administrators. They had a network that was not confined to one kingdom's borders. Their commanderies were therefore more than religious houses. They were nodes in a medieval system of movement, of goods, men, messages, and money. A visitor might see a chapel and a few brothers. A local farmer might know the order as a landlord. A crusader might know it as a military brotherhood. A ruler might know it as a financial partner. Each view was true, but none was complete. That partial visibility helped feed the myths. When people can see the effects of a network, but not all of its inner workings, imagination steps in to finish the picture. A chest sealed behind a door becomes a treasure room. A private initiation becomes a suspicious ritual. A disciplined silence becomes evidence of conspiracy. The Templars' actual wealth was impressive enough, but the wealth people imagined was larger, stranger, and far more dangerous. And because the Order's properties were spread across so many regions, it was difficult for outsiders to measure exactly what they possessed. Medieval records were uneven. Rumor moved faster than accounting. Envy needed no audit. This matters because the fall of the Templars was not only a story of accusations, it was also a story of assets. When Philip IV moved against them, he was not striking a poor band of wandering holy men. He was striking an institution with estates, buildings, reserves, documents, debts, obligations, and a reputation for guarding treasure. The charges would be religious. The language would be heresy, corruption, and blasphemy. But behind the spiritual drama stood a material reality no serious telling can ignore. The Templars had become useful because they were rich. They became vulnerable for the same reason. There is a temptation, especially in modern retellings, to search for one hidden prize, a lost relic, a secret text, a buried fortune, some forbidden knowledge locked away beneath a chapel floor. Those legends are powerful because they turn a vast administrative network into something simple enough to picture. One treasure, one secret, one reason for destruction. But history is often colder than legend. The treasure may have been the network itself, the land, the credit, the houses, the trust, the ability to move resources across borders, the strange legal independence that allowed the temple to operate inside kingdoms without being fully swallowed by them. That was a kind of wealth no single chest could contain, and to a ruler in need, it may have looked less like sacred property than an answer waiting to be seized. A king in debt is rarely just a man with a problem. He is a weather system. Everyone beneath him feels the pressure change. By the early 14th century, Philip IV of France had become one of the most formidable rulers in Europe. Later generations would call him Philip the Fair, though the nickname referred more to his appearance than to his moral reputation. He was not a wild, theatrical king. He was colder than that in the historical imagination, disciplined, legal-minded, severe, and surrounded by officials who knew how to turn royal will into documents, charges, procedures, and confiscations. That last word matters. Confiscation. Philip's France was ambitious, and ambition was expensive. War cost money. Government cost money. Royal prestige cost money. Conflict with England, pressure in Flanders, the machinery of administration, and the general appetite of monarchy all demanded resources. Medieval kings did not possess unlimited treasuries simply because they wore crowns. They borrowed, taxed, squeezed, negotiated, devalued coinage, and searched for new sources of revenue with a persistence that could feel, to those targeted, very much like persecution. Philip had already shown a willingness to move against wealthy or vulnerable groups when the crown needed funds. The Lombards, a broad label often used for Italian moneylenders and merchants, became one such target. Their financial usefulness made them visible. Their foreignness made them easier to isolate. Jewish communities, too, suffered under royal policy. In 1306, Philip expelled the Jews from France and seized property and debts owed to them. It was an act wrapped in religious and political language, but the financial benefit to the crown was difficult to miss. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable in a very human way. Philip did not need to invent the idea that certain groups were suspicious. Medieval society already supplied him with prejudice, anxiety, and resentment. What he needed was a reason to turn those feelings into policy. A king with skilled lawyers could make a seizure look like purification. A financial move could be presented as moral correction. The treasury could be refilled while the public was told that danger had been removed. It is a pattern worth noticing before the Templars enter the center of the frame. Because when Philip looked toward the temple, he was not looking at an ordinary religious community. He was looking at an organization with property across his kingdom, a reputation for holding wealth, and a legal position that made it frustratingly independent. The Templars were not simply rich. They were rich in a way that did not naturally answer to him. A poorer king might have tolerated that. Philip was not in a tolerant mood. Still, it would be too simple to reduce the entire affair to a robbery. History rarely offers villains who announce their motives so politely. Philip may have genuinely believed, or convinced himself, that the order was corrupt. His advisors may have believed some of the accusations, especially once confessions began appearing under pressure. Rumors about the Templars had circulated before the arrests, and the fall of the Crusader states had damaged the prestige of all military orders. After the loss of Acre in 1291, the original purpose of the Templars had become harder to explain to ordinary people in the West. If they no longer held the Holy Land, what exactly justified their wealth? That question did not create guilt, but it created an opening. Philip understood openings. He had already fought a dramatic struggle with Pope Boniface VIII, a conflict that revealed just how far the French crown was willing to go when royal authority felt challenged. The old medieval dream of a neat hierarchy, Pope above kings in spiritual matters, kings ruling under divine order, was becoming messier in practice. Philip wanted a monarchy that did not bow easily. He wanted control, revenue, obedience, and the legal language to make all of it appear necessary. The Templars sat at the intersection of everything he desired and everything he could not fully command. They were wealthy, but not his; armed, but not his army; French in membership and property, yet international in structure; religious, yet not safely under the authority of French bishops; useful, yet inconvenient. And perhaps worst of all, they were respected enough that he could not simply take what he wanted without a story. So a story would have to be built. This is one of the quiet cruelties of political power. It prefers to arrive with a moral explanation. A king does not say, "I need money, and you have it." He says, "There is corruption." He says, "There is danger." He says, "The realm must be protected." Sometimes those claims are true. Sometimes they are partly true. Sometimes they become true enough in the public mind because the machinery of authority repeats them with confidence. For Philip, the charge of heresy offered something stronger than ordinary suspicion. Heresy was not merely misconduct. It was spiritual treason. It could justify arrest, interrogation, seizure, and humiliation. It could transform a financial target into an enemy of God. It could make hesitation look like weakness. And if the target was a religious military order whose rituals were private, whose wealth was envied, and whose independence irritated the crown, then accusation could do what an army might not. It could enter the imagination before the accused had time to defend themselves. That is the Philip we must keep in view. Not a cartoon miser counting coins in a locked room, but a hard political operator ruling a kingdom hungry for money and obedience. His genius, if we can call it that, was not merely in wanting the Templars' wealth. Many people may have envied the temple. Philip's skill was in finding the kind of accusation that could make the destruction of the order seem not greedy, but righteous. The king needed money. But more than that, he needed a reason the world would accept. A king who wants money may begin with the treasury. A king who wants control begins by studying loyalties. The Knights Templar were troubling to Philip IV, not only because they possessed wealth, but because their wealth was protected by a structure that did not bend easily toward the French crown. They lived on French soil. They owned French properties. Many of their brothers were Frenchmen, and yet, in the deepest legal and spiritual sense, the order did not belong to France. It belonged to the Church. More precisely, it answered to the Pope. That distinction was not decorative. In medieval politics, jurisdiction was power. The right to judge, tax, summon, punish, or protect someone could shape the fate of entire institutions. The Templars had been granted privileges that placed them beyond much ordinary local interference. They could operate with a freedom that other communities did not enjoy. To supporters, this protected a sacred military mission from petty politics. To a king like Philip, it could look like a rival authority woven through his own kingdom. A rival does not need to claim your throne to threaten you. Sometimes it only needs to be ungovernable. The Templars' independence was especially awkward because it came attached to military prestige. These were not monks quietly copying manuscripts in a cloister. The order had been created for war. Its brothers had fought in the East. Its name carried the memory of crusader fortresses, battlefield discipline, and sacrifice. Even after the fall of Acre in 1291, even after the crusading project in the Holy Land had suffered a wound from which it never truly recovered, the Templars still possessed the aura of holy soldiers. Aura matters. A king could order the arrest of merchants, moneylenders, or unpopular minorities, and expect resistance to be limited. But the Templars were different. They had friends among the nobility. They had served kings. They were part of the religious imagination of Europe. Their white mantles and red crosses had been admired for generations. If Philip was going to strike them, he needed more than suspicion. He needed a charge strong enough to make their old honor collapse under its own weight. This is why the accusations would have to be spiritual. Ordinary financial wrongdoing would not be enough. Corruption might stain them, but it might not destroy them. Bad administration could be corrected. Greed could be criticized. Even arrogance could be tolerated if the order remained useful. But heresy was different. Heresy could reach into the private chamber of identity. It could say, "These men were never what they seemed. Their holiness was a mask. Their discipline was a cover. Their vows were not merely broken. They were inverted." That was the kind of accusation capable of transforming admiration into disgust. And there was another problem, quieter, but just as dangerous for the temple. Their purpose had become harder to defend. For nearly 2 centuries, the logic of the order had depended on the Holy Land. They protected pilgrims. They defended crusader states. They held castles at the edge of Latin Christendom. But after Acre fell, the crusader presence in the eastern Mediterranean changed dramatically. The old mission did not vanish overnight, yet it no longer looked as clear to people watching from France. If the Holy Land was lost, why did the Templars still hold so much land in Europe? If the pilgrim roads they had been founded to protect were no longer protected in the old way, why did donations continue to flow? If they were poor monks, why did kings borrow from them? These questions were not proof of guilt. They were the cracks through which suspicion entered. And Philip's government knew how to widen cracks. The Templars also represented something personally inconvenient to royal ambition: a network. Not a rumor-soaked secret society in the modern fantasy sense, but a real administrative network of commanderies, treasurers, local officers, estates, and communications. Networks are difficult for centralized rulers because they move things sideways. Money can pass from one region to another. Orders can travel through channels not controlled by the crown. Loyalty can be reinforced by vows that do not begin or end at the palace. For Philip, who had already shown his appetite for a stronger monarchy, this mattered deeply. He was not merely patching holes in a budget. He was building a kingdom in which royal authority reached further, spoke louder, and tolerated fewer exceptions. The temple was an exception with land, money, men, and memory. That combination was combustible. It is worth pausing here, because modern retellings sometimes imagine Philip staring at the Templars and seeing only treasure. Treasure was part of it. It would be naive to pretend otherwise. But treasure alone does not explain the intensity of the campaign. A chest can be stolen quietly. A debt can be disputed. Property can be taxed, pressured, or slowly absorbed. Philip did something more dramatic. He tried to ruin the meaning of the order. That is the tell. He did not simply accuse the Templars of being too rich. He accused them of being false at the root. Their initiation rituals, their brotherhood, their secrecy, their internal discipline, all of it could be reinterpreted as evidence of corruption. The very features that made them coherent as an order became, under pressure, the signs of a hidden disease. This is how institutions are destroyed most efficiently, not by denying their public image, but by reversing it. The guardians become traitors. The poor monks become hoarders. The defenders of the cross become enemies of the cross. The obedient servants of God become servants of something darker. Once that reversal is accepted, pity becomes harder. Confiscation becomes purification. Violence becomes justice. Of course, none of this means every Templar was innocent of every possible misconduct. Large institutions are never made of saints alone. There may have been abuses, arrogance, financial disputes, private resentments, and brothers who failed their vows in ordinary human ways. But the leap from human failure to organized heresy is enormous. That leap required pressure, planning, and the political will to make a scandal so large that no one could easily step around it. Philip understood that a half-accusation would be dangerous. If the order survived, it might recover. If the Pope intervened too firmly, Philip might be humiliated. If the nobility rallied around the Templars, the crown might face resistance. So the blow had to be sudden, coordinated, and overwhelming. The Templars had to wake not to an inquiry, but to captivity. Their papers had to be seized before they could organize a defense. Their leaders had to be taken before they could speak as leaders. In that sense, the threat behind the throne was not only the temple itself. It was the possibility that any powerful institution could exist inside France with a loyalty Philip could not fully command. The Templars were a test case. If the king could humble them, wealthy, sacred, international, armed, protected by papal privilege, then the message to everyone else would be unmistakable. No mantle was too holy, no charter too old, no reputation too bright to be dragged into the court of royal necessity. And so the order stood in a perilous place, perhaps without fully understanding how perilous it had become. Its brothers were accustomed to criticism. They were accustomed to responsibility, privilege, and rumor. They may have known they had enemies. But enemies are one thing. A king building a case is another. By the autumn of 1307, the danger was no longer theoretical. It had entered the sealed letter. A royal order does not become dangerous when it is read. It becomes dangerous when it is written. By September of 1307, the attack on the Knights Templar was already moving through France in a form more powerful than rumor and quieter than an army. Instructions were prepared. Seals were fixed. Messengers carried letters into the provinces. Local officials received commands that were not to be opened until the appointed day. This is one of the most chilling details in the entire affair because it shows that the fall of the temple was not an emotional outburst. It was not a king waking one morning and deciding in a flash of anger to strike. It was administration. It was coordination. It was the cold patience of government. The officials who received the king's letters did not necessarily know what was inside them at first. That secrecy mattered. Philip's government understood that the Templars had houses, servants, allies, tenants, and contacts across the realm. A warning in one region might travel faster than royal power in another. A single loose tongue could give the order time to hide documents, move treasure, appeal to protectors, or simply flee. So the command had to remain sealed. Imagine the scene, not in one dramatic palace chamber, but across dozens of local centers of authority. A royal officer receives a packet. He understands that it comes from the king. He understands that it is important, but the contents are locked behind the ritual of obedience. Do not open until instructed. The suspense is not theatrical. It is procedural. That is what makes it so effective. Bureaucracy, when used this way, can turn a whole kingdom into a trap. Inside those orders was the plan for a synchronized arrest. The Templars were to be seized on the same morning, their property taken into royal custody, their persons placed under guard, their possessions inventoried. The timing was essential. If one commandery was warned, others might prepare. If one senior official hesitated, the operation might become uneven. Philip needed the event to feel complete before anyone had time to understand it. The target was not only the bodies of the brothers, it was the order's ability to respond. That is a distinction worth keeping. Arresting a man removes him from the street. Arresting hundreds of men at nearly the same time removes the possibility of a shared voice. It breaks correspondence. It interrupts hierarchy. It turns an institution into isolated prisoners, each suddenly dependent on the mercy of officials who already believe, or have been ordered to believe, that something monstrous has been uncovered. For the Templars, this was especially devastating. Their strength had always been collective. A lone brother was a vowed man in a mantle. The order was the network. The commanderies, the officers, the rule, the treasury, the documents, the habits of obedience that connected one house to another. Philip's strike was aimed precisely at that network. He did not challenge it gradually. He cut across it in a single morning. And yet, before the sword came the script. The accusations had to exist in writing. The instructions had to tell officials what to look for, what to seize, how to question, how to frame the arrests. This was not merely enforcement. It was narrative management. Philip's government needed the first public understanding of the event to belong to the crown. The Templars were not to be seen as respected religious brothers mysteriously taken by force. They were to be seen as suspected heretics finally exposed. That difference could determine whether people pitied them or recoiled from them. The secrecy also reveals something Philip may have feared. If the charges were so obvious, if the order's corruption was so widely known and undeniable, why the need for such careful concealment? Why not summon them openly? Why not present evidence first, then proceed? The answer, perhaps, is that the operation depended on surprise because the evidence, at least before interrogation, was not strong enough to risk resistance. This does not prove the charges false by itself, but it does tell us the king was not simply trusting truth to win. He was arranging the battlefield on which truth would be judged. That battlefield was legal, political, and psychological. The sealed letters created a world in which the Templars would first encounter the accusation from inside a prison cell. Once arrested, they could be separated. Once separated, they could be pressured. Once pressured, some would confess. Once confessions existed, the crown could point backward and say the arrests had been justified all along. It is a grim circle. Suspicion permits arrest. Arrest enables coercion. Coercion produces confession. Confession confirms suspicion. This is why the month before October 13th matters so much. The famous date receives the legend, but the machinery was already turning. The legend remembers the doors breaking open. History asks who wrote the orders, who sealed them, who delivered them, who waited, and who understood that dawn would be the perfect hour for a kingdom to move before its victims could gather themselves. The Templars had spent nearly 2 centuries building a reputation across Europe. Philip's government spent weeks preparing the moment when that reputation would be publicly inverted. There is something almost modern in the precision of it. Not modern in technology, of course. The messengers rode on horses. The records were parchment. The seals were wax. But the instinct is recognizable. Control the timing. Control the documents. Control the first story people hear. By the time the brothers understood the scale of what was happening, the crown wanted the public to believe it already knew enough. And in the cold before sunrise, when the seals were finally broken, France did not discover a scandal. France received one. The accusations against the Templars were not small. They could not be small. A modest charge would have produced a modest scandal, and Philip did not need a modest scandal. He needed something strong enough to turn admiration into horror. Something that could make noble families hesitate before defending the order. Something that could make the Pope pause before condemning the king's actions too sharply. Something that could reach ordinary people not as a legal dispute, but as a contamination. So the charges were written in the darkest language available. The Templars were accused of heresy. They were accused of denying Christ. They were accused of spitting on the cross during secret initiation ceremonies. They were accused of obscene kisses, sexual misconduct, corruption, fraud, and secret worship of strange idols or demonic figures. In some versions of the accusations, the order was made to sound less like a military brotherhood and more like an underground church of inversion, where everything holy had been turned backward behind closed doors. That was the point. The scandal depended not only on what was claimed, but on what those claims allowed people to imagine. For centuries, the Templars had used secrecy as a normal part of discipline. Initiation rituals were private. Internal rules were guarded. The order had its own hierarchy, its own ceremonies, its own habits of obedience. None of that automatically suggests guilt. Many religious institutions had private customs. But secrecy, once suspicion enters the room, changes shape. It becomes a blank wall onto which enemies can paint almost anything. And Philip's case required that wall. The charge of spitting on the cross was especially devastating because it attacked the center of Templar identity. These were men whose public image had been built around the defense of Christian holy places. Their symbol was the cross. Their legitimacy came from service to the church. To accuse them of insulting the cross at the very moment of joining the order was not just to accuse them of sin. It was to accuse them of being a lie from the beginning. That is far more powerful than saying they had become corrupt over time. It says corruption was the entrance fee. The allegations of idol worship worked in a similar way. The evidence here is notoriously unstable, tangled in interrogation records, rumor, fear, and the language of heresy trials. Different testimonies described different objects, different heads, different names, or nothing clear at all. Later legend would grow these fragments into something much larger and stranger, but the historical ground is uneven. What matters is not that a coherent secret idol can be confidently reconstructed. It cannot. What matters is that the accusation made the order feel spiritually alien. To a medieval audience, heresy was frightening because it suggested hidden rot inside the Christian body. A heretic might look familiar, speak familiar prayers, wear familiar clothing, and yet secretly belong to a dangerous error. That fear made the Templars vulnerable in a particular way. Their public holiness could be made to seem like camouflage. The more respected they had been, the more shocking the reversal became. There were also accusations involving sexual misconduct, including claims that brothers were encouraged toward forbidden acts or improper intimacy. These charges served several purposes at once. They humiliated. They made the accused seem morally polluted. They suggested that private brotherhood had become private corruption. And because sexuality was so closely tied to religious discipline, any violation of chastity could be framed not merely as weakness, but as proof of deeper spiritual disorder. Again, caution is necessary. The existence of an accusation does not make the accusation true. The existence of a confession does not settle the matter when the confession comes from a prisoner under terror, isolation, or torture. Medieval legal culture did not treat coercion as modern courts ideally would. Pain could be seen as a tool for extracting truth. But to a historian, pain is also a machine for producing. Whatever answer seems most likely to make the pain stop. That is one reason the Templar case remains so disturbing. The charges were spectacular. The conditions under which many of them were confirmed were brutal. Those two facts cannot be separated. Fraud and corruption accusations may have been more believable to some listeners because the order had become wealthy. People could understand greed. They could believe that administrators mishandled funds, that powerful men became arrogant, that property brought temptation. Such claims did not require a complete inversion of reality. Large organizations often attract resentment because they sometimes deserve a portion of it. But fraud alone would not have shattered the temple's sacred image with the same force. Heresy did. The genius and the cruelty of the case lay in combining the plausible with the monstrous. If people already wondered why poor monks held so much land, they might be more willing to hear that wealth had corrupted them. If they already disliked private rituals, they might be more willing to imagine blasphemy. If they already feared that military orders had failed in the East, they might be more willing to believe divine favor had withdrawn for a reason. Suspicion does not need to create a story from nothing. It only needs to arrange existing doubts into a darker pattern. This is why sensational accusations are so useful to power. They overwhelm careful thought. A charge of administrative misconduct invites documents, witnesses, arguments, and accounting. A charge of secret devil worship enters the mind differently. It produces revulsion before investigation. It makes defense sound suspicious. After all, what would a secret heretic do except deny being one? That trap is ancient. The Templars were placed inside it. Once the accusations were public, every part of their identity could be reinterpreted. Their discipline became menace. Their silence became concealment. Their wealth became proof of greed. Their international reach became conspiracy. Their private initiations became the imagined theater of blasphemy. Even their courage could be twisted into fanaticism. There is a lesson here about reputation. A reputation built over generations can be broken quickly if the attack strikes at the symbolic center. The Templars did not merely possess land and money. They possessed meaning. They meant holy war, protection, sacrifice, Christian knighthood purified by vows, Philip's accusations attacked that meaning with surgical precision, and once meaning collapses, property becomes easier to take. We should be careful, though, not to flatten the public response into one simple reaction. Some people may have believed the charges immediately. Some may have doubted them quietly. Some may have been afraid to speak. Some may have cared less about truth than about survival. Medieval Europe was not a single mind. But public scandal does not require universal belief. It requires enough noise, enough authority, enough fear, and enough people deciding that defending the accused is too dangerous. By that measure, the accusations succeeded. They changed the question. Before the arrests, one might ask, why would the king move against the temple? After the charges spread, the safer question became, what if the king was right? That shift was everything, because now the order had to defend not only its actions, but its soul. It had to answer claims designed to be almost impossible to disprove, especially after its leaders had been seized, its houses searched, its documents taken, and its brothers scattered into cells. The Templars were no longer speaking from a position of institutional strength. They were speaking, when they were allowed to speak at all, from inside the machinery of accusation. And the machinery had already begun to grind. The public heard of blasphemy. The crown saw opportunity. The church faced a nightmare. And somewhere in the middle of it all were men who had once believed that the cross on their mantle would protect them from the worst suspicions of Christendom. Now that same cross had become the center of the charge against them. Jacques de Molay was not arrested as a footnote. He was the face of the order. By 1307, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar carried a burden that was almost impossible to separate from the history of the Brotherhood itself. He represented its memory, its discipline, its failures, its ambitions, and its claim to still matter after the loss of the Holy Land. To seize him was not merely to arrest one man, it was to strike the head, the voice, and the symbol of the temple all at once. Philip understood symbols. The arrest of lesser brothers would have frightened the order. The seizure of local houses would have disrupted its network. But taking the Grand Master turned the royal operation into something more final, more theatrical, and more difficult to reverse. It told France that this was not an investigation into a few corrupt men hiding in distant commanderies. The king was saying the sickness, if sickness there was, reached the top. That mattered because medieval institutions were deeply hierarchical. Authority flowed through office, vow, and rank. A Grand Master was not an elected mascot for public relations. He was the senior figure of a military religious order with international prestige. When Jacques de Molay fell into royal hands, the order lost the one person most visibly able to speak for it as a whole. The timing made the blow even sharper. Only shortly before the arrests, de Molay had been in France discussing the future of crusading and the military orders. The Templars still hoped to shape the conversation about a renewed effort in the East. Their enemies, meanwhile, had another future in mind. The contrast is almost cruel. An order imagining policy, reform, perhaps a new campaign, while the machinery of its destruction was being prepared around it. This is one of those moments when history feels less like a straight road and more like two realities passing through the same room. In one reality, the Grand Master was still a high officer of Christendom, a man whose order had defended castles, carried treasure, guarded pilgrims, and served rulers. In the other, he was already becoming a prisoner in a case that would define him more than any battlefield ever had. The trap closed before he could step fully into either role. Alongside de Molay, other senior Templars were taken. Their arrest was essential. Philip could not allow the order's leadership to remain intact while ordinary brothers were questioned. A surviving command structure might coordinate appeals, challenge procedure, preserve records, or reach the Pope with a unified defense. Remove the leaders, and the order becomes a collection of isolated voices, some frightened, some confused, some loyal, some ready to say whatever might save their lives. So, this was not just decapitation in a metaphorical sense. It was strategic silence. An institution can endure accusation if it has time to gather itself. It can send letters, summon witnesses, produce accounts, clarify rituals, discipline unreliable members, and frame its own story. The Templars were denied that first breath. Their leaders were not standing before a council with documents in hand. They were in custody, facing charges that seemed designed to make every denial sound like further proof of concealment. De Molay's position was especially painful because he had to bear two identities at once. As a man, he could be frightened, exhausted, confused, and vulnerable to pressure. As Grand Master, he was expected to embody the order's honor. Medieval history often turns such figures into statues, but prisoners are not statues. They have bodies. They feel cold. They fear pain. They hear threats. They understand, sometimes too late, that the rules they thought protected them have changed. That human detail matters. Because when we speak of the Grand Master in chains, the phrase can sound almost ceremonial, as though destiny has dressed him for tragedy. But the reality was more degrading. Arrest strips away rhythm, strips away. A man accustomed to command now waits for doors to open. A man whose seal once carried authority now depends on the decisions of jailers, clerks, interrogators, and royal officials. Power does not always disappear with a dramatic speech. Sometimes it disappears when someone else decides when you may eat, sleep, speak, or stand. For Philip, the sight of senior Templars under guard was a political victory. It demonstrated reach. It showed that papal privilege had not prevented royal action. It suggested that even the most honored warriors of the Church could be made answerable to the King of France when the alleged crime was grave enough. That message traveled beyond the prisons. To the nobility, it warned against assuming old prestige could protect anyone. To the Church, it created a crisis that could not be ignored. To the public, it gave the accusations weight. If the Grand Master himself had been arrested, surely something serious must have been found. Authority has a way of making its own evidence before evidence is tested, and this is where the story becomes morally dangerous. The arrest of a leader can look like proof because people often mistake boldness for certainty. A king would not dare do such a thing unless he knew, people may have thought. But rulers have always understood that daring can create belief. Once the impossible act has happened, the mind rushes to justify it. The alternative, that a sacred and respected institution has been attacked for political reasons, is too unsettling for many to hold at once. So the prisoner's chains became part of the argument against him. Jacques de Molay's arrest also gave Philip leverage over the Pope. Pope Clement V could object to procedure. He could worry about jurisdiction. He could insist that the Templars were a religious order and therefore belonged under ecclesiastical authority. But the king already had the bodies. He had the documents. Soon, he would have confessions. The balance had shifted before the formal debate could begin. That was the brilliance of acting first. It forced everyone else to respond to Philip's reality. The Grand Master did not enter the story in chains because he was proven guilty. He entered chains because the king had decided that proof, pressure, and politics could be arranged after the seizure. That is a hard distinction, and it should not be softened. Arrest is not verdict. Confession is not always truth. Power can place a man inside a narrative before the facts have been allowed to breathe. Still, de Molay was not merely a passive symbol. His later choices, especially his recantation and final defiance, would help transform him from an accused leader into a martyr-like figure in the Templar imagination. But that moment had not yet come. In 1307, he was caught in the first shock of a campaign whose scale even he may not have fully understood. For now, the Grand Master was not standing before flames. He was waiting inside the system that would decide whether he had a future. And around him, the order he led was being broken into separate rooms, separate interrogations, separate fears. Men who had once belonged to a brotherhood built on obedience and shared identity now faced the crown as individuals. That was the deeper victory of the arrests. Philip did not only seize leaders, he changed the conditions under which truth would be spoken. A united order might have defended itself. A scattered order could be made to confess. Not every Templar arrested in France was a famous knight. That is easy to forget, because the legend prefers commanders, castles, and the Grand Master in chains. But the order was not made only of battlefield brothers with noble names and scarred reputations from the East. It also contained priests, sergeants, servants, administrators, treasurers, estate managers, craftsmen, and men whose daily lives had more to do with accounts, animals, kitchens, chapels, and rents than with crusader combat. When the royal net fell, it did not carefully separate legend from labor. It caught the institution whole. Some of the men taken that morning may have known very little about the great political contest unfolding above them. A brother serving at a rural commandery might understand the order's rule, his own duties, the rhythms of prayer and work, the local tenants, the inventory of grain, the condition of horses, the repairs needed on a roof. He might have heard rumors, of course. Medieval houses were not sealed against gossip. But rumor is different from waking to armed officials and discovering that the king's officers now considered your entire life suspicious. That sudden disorientation was part of the violence. Prison does not begin with torture. It begins with removal. A man is taken from the place where objects make sense, the bench where he sat, the chapel where he prayed, the stable he crossed each morning, the people who knew his habits. Then he is placed somewhere designed to reduce him. A cell, a locked room, a guarded chamber, a place where time no longer belongs to him. For the arrested Templars, isolation became a weapon. It broke the collective confidence of the brotherhood. A man who might have stood firm beside his companions could become uncertain when he could not hear them, could not ask what they had said, could not know whether the leaders had confessed, resisted, disappeared, or died. Silence in that setting was not peaceful. It was informational starvation, and it worked on the mind. Imagine being told that others have already admitted the truth. Imagine being told that denial will only make things worse. Imagine being a minor brother, not a great officer, not a man trained in law or diplomacy, but someone who had entered the order years earlier because it offered discipline, meaning, food, status, salvation, or simply a place in the world. Now the king's men insist that the very vows that shaped your life were part of a hidden crime. What defense does such a man have? He may not know the wider records. He may not understand papal jurisdiction. He may not have access to anyone who can advise him. He may not even be certain what answer will keep him alive. This is where the Templar trials become most haunting. Not because of the famous names, but because of the ordinary ones. History often preserves the leaders and blurs the rest into numbers. Yet the machinery of accusation depended on those less famous men. A scandal needed voices. It needed confessions. It needed repetition from different mouths, even if those mouths spoke under fear. The prison conditions varied, and we should be careful not to pretend every captive endured the exact same experience. Some were held more harshly than others. Some faced greater pressure. Some may have been treated according to local decisions, local resources, or the particular zeal of officials. But the broader pattern is clear enough. The prisoners were vulnerable, separated, and placed under intense psychological and physical strain. Bread and water were not just food. They were a message. They reminded the prisoner that the body could be narrowed down to survival. Hunger makes the world smaller. Cold makes the world smaller. Darkness, uncertainty, and waiting make it smaller still. A man under those conditions may begin by defending doctrine and end by bargaining for one more hour without pain. That is not weakness in any simple moral sense. It is the body doing what bodies do when authority turns discomfort into argument. The point was not only to punish. The point was to produce speech. And this is where this case against the Templars becomes deeply unstable. The Crown did not merely collect testimony from free men calmly recalling events. It gathered statements from prisoners whose circumstances had been designed to break resistance. Even before formal torture entered the room, captivity itself could bend memory, judgment, and courage. A man might confess because he believed the accusation after hearing it repeated. He might confess because he thought confession would bring mercy. He might confess because he had been told his superiors had already admitted guilt. He might confess because he wanted to avoid harsher treatment. He might confess because the questions were shaped in such a way that only certain answers seemed acceptable. And once spoken, a confession became difficult to escape. Words uttered in fear could harden into evidence. A frightened answer could be copied by a clerk, sealed into a record, and carried into the larger case. The living tremble in the cell. The written page looks calm. That is one of the cruel differences between experience and archive. The document preserves the sentence, but not always the terror surrounding it. For the ordinary Templar, this meant that his private breaking could become part of a public truth he had not freely chosen. The isolation also attacked the order's religious identity. The Templars had been trained to obey, to live under rule, to trust hierarchy. But now hierarchy had been severed. If a brother had doubts, who could hear them? If he wanted to confess in the spiritual sense, who controlled access to priests? If he wanted to appeal to the Pope, how could a man under guard reach the highest authority in Christendom? The very obedience that had once bound the brotherhood together could become a liability. Men trained to submit to authority were now surrounded by a different authority, one that spoke in the name of the king and claimed to act against heresy. Refusal was not simply disobedience. It could be made to look like stubbornness and sin. There is a painful irony here. The Templars had spent generations building a life around discipline. Philip's officials used discipline against them. The order had trained men to endure hardship. The prison turned hardship into interrogation. The brotherhood had valued silence. The crown made silence suspicious. Everything was being reversed. And somewhere in those cells, the famous and the obscure entered the same reduced condition. Jacques de Molay may have carried the symbolic weight of the temple, but he was still a prisoner. A treasurer might know where funds had passed, but he was still a prisoner. A sergeant who had never shaped policy, a priest who had served the chapel, a brother assigned to an estate far from the great decisions of the order. Each could be pulled into the same dark logic. The accusation did not need them to be important. It needed them to be useful. This is why the story should not be told only from the throne room or the papal court. The fall of the Templars happened in administrative orders, yes. It happened in royal ambition, yes. But it also happened in the smaller spaces where men sat alone, waiting for footsteps, listening for keys, trying to guess what answer would preserve their souls, their bodies, or simply the next morning. Power often announces itself in public. It does its most intimate work in private. By the time the interrogations deepened, many Templars had already been weakened by more than fear of punishment. They had been separated from context, from counsel, from one another, from the daily signs that told them who they were. A brotherhood built on shared vows was being converted into a series of isolated human beings, each pressured to confirm a story written before he was allowed to speak. And once that process began, the next step was not difficult to imagine. A prisoner who would not confess could be shown that silence had a price. Pain has a way of simplifying the world. It can take a man with a past, a rank, a conscience, a language of prayer, a lifetime of loyalties, and reduce him to one immediate thought: make it stop. That is why the confessions of the Templars must be handled with extreme care, not dismissed carelessly, not accepted hungrily, handled carefully, because the words exist, they were recorded. Men did confess to terrible things, but the conditions under which many of those confessions were produced were so compromised that the historian has to stand at the edge of the record and ask not only, what did he say, but what was done to him before he said it? The difference is everything. Torture in the medieval legal world was not always seen as a corruption of justice. In certain proceedings, especially those involving heresy, it could be treated as a grim instrument for extracting hidden truth. The logic was simple and dangerous. If a crime was secret, if witnesses were few, if the accused were believed to be spiritually diseased, then pain might force the truth out where ordinary questioning could not. But pain is not loyal to truth. Pain is loyal to escape. Among the methods used against prisoners were suspension, burning, and the rack. Techniques designed not merely to injure the body, but to make the body feel that it had become an enemy of the mind. Suspension could wrench joints and muscles until time itself seemed to stretch. Fire could turn a single point of flesh into the center of the universe. The rack could make resistance feel mathematically impossible, each turn of pressure translating authority into agony. We do not need to linger over the details. The point is not spectacle. The point is reliability. A confession produced under such conditions tells us that a prisoner was under unbearable pressure. It does not automatically tell us that the accusation was true. A man on the rack may confess to what he has done, what he has not done, what he thinks the interrogator wants, what he has heard others confess, or what he hopes will end the torment before his body fails. That uncertainty sits at the heart of the Templar tragedy. The crown needed confession because the charges were extraordinary. Heresy, denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, secret idol worship. These were not accusations easily proven by ordinary evidence. They concerned private ceremonies, internal customs, whispered acts supposedly hidden from the world. Without testimony from inside the order, the case remained unstable. With confession, even coerced confession, the king gained something far more useful than rumor. He gained voices from within the temple. That was devastating. Once a Templar admitted even part of the charge, the confession could be copied, summarized, repeated, and used to pressure the next prisoner. Others have confessed. Few sentences are more powerful in an interrogation room. It isolates the prisoner while pretending to surround him with proof. It suggests that resistance is useless, that loyalty has already collapsed elsewhere, that denial only marks a man as stubborn. The result can become a chain reaction. One frightened brother confesses. Another hears that confession exists. A third is told the leaders have admitted guilt. A fourth, exhausted and alone, tries to give a limited answer, perhaps admitting to some strange initiation gesture while denying deeper heresy. A clerk records the statement in the language of the proceeding. Later, the record appears as if a pattern has emerged. But patterns produced by pressure are not the same as patterns produced by truth. This is not to say that every testimony was identical or that every prisoner reacted the same way. Some Templars confessed quickly. Some resisted. Some admitted certain ritual humiliations but denied believing them. Some later withdrew their statements. Some held firm at terrible cost. Human beings under fear do not behave according to a clean moral diagram. They improvise. They break. They bargain. They surprise even themselves. That variety is one reason the records are so difficult. If the entire order had confessed freely and consistently, the case would look different. If every brother had denied everything without exception, the case would also look different. Instead, we find a disturbing middle ground. Confessions, contradictions, recantations, repetitions, and statements shaped by conditions that make certainty difficult. The archive does not hand us a simple answer. It hands us damage. And Philip's officials knew how to use damage. A confession did not need to be philosophically pure to be politically useful. It only needed to exist. Once it existed, the public story could harden. The Templars themselves have admitted the corruption. The order's defenders now had to explain why men would confess to such shameful crimes if nothing had happened. That question has emotional force, but it ignores the obvious answer, because terror can make shame preferable to pain. There is also a spiritual dimension that made confession especially complicated. In a Christian society, confession was not only a legal act, it carried religious weight. To confess could mean seeking mercy, saving the soul, submitting to correction. Interrogators could exploit that boundary between law and salvation. A prisoner might be encouraged to believe that admission would bring forgiveness, while denial would endanger both body and soul. That is a cruel arrangement. The gate to mercy placed behind the words your captors want to hear. For some Templars, the accusations may have been almost incomprehensible at first. A ritual act remembered as symbolic, disciplinary, or even meaningless could be reinterpreted under questioning as blasphemy. A private custom could be forced into the vocabulary of heresy. A frightened man might try to explain nuance to a system that had no interest in nuance. And under torture, nuance is usually the first thing to die. The rack does not ask follow-up questions with scholarly patience. It asks for surrender. This is why modern certainty about the Templars should be approached with humility. It is tempting to choose one clean version. Either the order was secretly guilty of everything, or every charge was invented from nothing. The evidence resists both extremes. There may have been initiation practices that outsiders would find disturbing. There may have been rough rituals, symbolic tests, or localized abuses. There may have been brothers who behaved badly, officers who misused power, and customs that looked ugly when dragged into daylight. But organized devil worship, systematic hatred of the cross, a secret heretical religion at the heart of the order? The evidence for that is far weaker, especially when so much of it comes through coercion. And that is the central point. The most sensational claims depended heavily on the least reliable conditions. The darker the accusation became, the more we must ask how it was produced. A confession extracted by fire may illuminate the cruelty of the interrogator more clearly than the soul of the accused. Philip, however, did not need perfect truth. He needed usable truth. That phrase is unpleasant, but it fits. Usable truth is what power extracts, edits, and repeats until it becomes politically sufficient. It may contain fragments of reality. It may contain exaggeration. It may contain lies spoken under pressure. Its strength does not come from purity. It comes from usefulness. For the French crown, the confessions were useful beyond measure. They justified the arrests after the fact. They placed the Pope in an impossible position. They weakened sympathy for the prisoners. They transformed the seizure of property into the cleansing of heresy. And perhaps most importantly, they made the destruction of the Templars seem as though it had been confirmed by the Templars themselves. That is the most haunting feature of coerced confession. It forces the victim to help build the case against himself. Once the words are spoken, they leave the cell. They travel where the prisoner cannot. They become cleaner on parchment than they ever were in the room. The trembling voice disappears. The smell of fear disappears. The threat, the pain, the exhaustion, the desperate calculation, all of it fades behind a recorded statement that looks formal, orderly, almost serene. History then inherits the parchment and must try to hear the room behind it. For many Templars, confession was not the end of suffering. It was the beginning of another trap. To confess might save a man from immediate torture, but it could also brand him forever. To recant later could mark him as relapsed, stubborn, or unrepentant. The system rewarded admission, then punished withdrawal. It allowed fear to speak, then treated later courage as guilt. That mechanism would prove deadly, because as the trials continued, some of the men who had confessed began to pull their words back. They insisted that what they had said was false, that it had been forced from them, that they had spoken to escape torment. Their recantations did not restore the world that had been broken, but they did reveal the weakness underneath the crown's triumph. If the confessions were freely given, why did so many later crumble? If the truth had been uncovered, why did it require so much pain to uncover it? And if the order was as monstrous as Philip claimed, why does the record so often sound less like the exposure of a conspiracy than the manufacture of one? These questions do not turn the Templars into perfect innocents. They do something more important. They prevent us from turning their confessions into a shortcut. The easy path is to read the admission and stop. The harder path is to ask what kind of world made that admission possible. In the prisons of France, truth did not walk calmly into the room. It was dragged there, bruised, frightened, and made to speak in the language of its captors. Pope Clement V did not receive the Templar crisis from a position of calm strength. He received it as a man already standing inside Philip's shadow. That does not mean Clement was simply a puppet, though later retellings often flatten him into one. The relationship was more uncomfortable than that. He was the Pope, head of the Latin Church, guardian of spiritual jurisdiction, and in theory, the one authority with the right to judge a religious military order like the Temple. But he was also politically vulnerable, deeply entangled with French pressure, and forced to respond after Philip had already acted. That last point is crucial. The arrests came first. The papal dilemma came afterward. Clement had reason to be disturbed. The King of France had moved against a major order of the Church without waiting for a proper papal process. Templars were not ordinary subjects of the crown. Their privileges, their vows, and their institutional identity placed them within the Church's sphere. If Philip could seize them by royal command, interrogate them under royal authority, and take control of their property, then the question was not only whether the Templars were guilty, The question was who had the power to decide. For a pope, that was dangerous ground. If Clement challenged Philip too sharply, he risked a political confrontation with one of Europe's strongest monarchs. If he accepted Philip's actions too easily, he risked allowing a king to dictate the fate of an order that belonged to the Church. Either path weakened him. Either path made the papacy look less like a judge and more like an institution being dragged behind events. Then came the confessions. They changed the air around the case. However unreliable many of them may have been, they could not simply be ignored once they existed. Men of the temple had admitted to shocking acts. Some senior figures appeared to confirm at least parts of the charges. To a medieval pope, heresy was not a minor matter that could be waved away as political noise. Even if Clement suspected royal manipulation, he still had to treat the allegations with gravity. A religious order accused of denying Christ, dishonoring the cross, and corrupting its own initiations could not be defended casually without making the Church itself appear indifferent to spiritual disease. This was Philip's advantage. He had placed Clement in a cage made of procedure, fear, and scandal. If the Pope condemned the king's actions too quickly, he could be accused of protecting heretics. If he endorsed the king too fully, he surrendered the Church's authority over its own servants. If he delayed, the rumors spread. If he investigated, the investigation would be shaped by confessions already gathered under royal pressure. Every option had a cost. Clement tried at moments to reassert control over the process. He wanted the matter brought under ecclesiastical authority. He could not simply let Philip own the case from beginning to end. But the problem with arriving second is that the first story has already entered the world. The Templars had already been arrested. Their property had already been seized. Their names had already been darkened. Their words, forced or not, had already begun to circulate as evidence. The Pope could question the process. He could not rewind the morning. There is a kind of tragedy in Clement's position, though it is not the heroic kind. He was not a martyr standing alone against tyranny. He was a cautious churchman moving through a political trap, trying to preserve authority without provoking a disaster he might not survive. His caution did not save the Templars, but it helps explain why the case unfolded as it did. Slowly, uneasily, with the papacy neither fully in command nor completely absent. The Templar affair also exposed a larger shift in medieval power. The great universal claims of the papacy had not vanished, but kings like Philip were becoming harder to restrain. Royal governments were more organized, more legally sophisticated, more willing to use public accusation as a weapon. A pope could still speak in the language of spiritual supremacy. A king could answer with prisons, documents, armed officers, and facts already created on the ground. In that contest, parchment and theology were not always enough. Clement's fear was not only personal, it was institutional. The charge of heresy was explosive because it threatened the purity of the Church from within. If the Templars were guilty, then a celebrated arm of Christian warfare had been rotten for generations. If they were innocent, then a Christian king had tortured and humiliated one of the Church's own orders for political gain. Neither conclusion was easy to bear, so the process became tangled. The Pope had to investigate without appearing soft. He had to resist Philip without appearing blind to sin. He had to consider the confessions without pretending that torture did not matter. He had to manage a scandal whose emotional force was already greater than the evidence deserved. This is often how power wins, not by proving everything, by making every alternative seem dangerous. For Clement, defending the Templars outright would have required more than legal authority. It would have required political courage, military leverage, and the ability to withstand a king who had already shown how far he was willing to go. The Pope had authority on parchment. Philip had prisoners in chains. That imbalance shaped everything. Outside France, the story did not unfold with the same darkness. That matters. If the Templars had truly been the same monstrous conspiracy everywhere, one might expect the same evidence to appear everywhere with the same force. But the response across Europe was uneven, hesitant, and often far less dramatic than Philip's version required. In England, in Aragon, in Portugal, and elsewhere, rulers did not always rush to believe the French accusations. Some were skeptical. Some obeyed papal commands reluctantly. Some arrested Templars because the Pope eventually ordered it, but without the same appetite for spectacle that Philip had shown. This unevenness is important because it reminds us that the French case was not simply the inevitable discovery of universal guilt. It was a political event with a French center of gravity. Philip's government had the prisoners. Philip's officials had the first confessions. Philip's kingdom had the machinery ready to move. Elsewhere, the charges often looked less convincing when removed from the pressure chamber that had produced them. In some places, Templars were held, questioned, and examined, but the results did not match the horror story France had announced. Confessions were fewer. Torture was less commonly used or less intensely applied. Local authorities sometimes seemed uncertain whether they were dealing with dangerous heretics or with a scandal imported from the French court. That uncertainty is revealing. It suggests that the case was strongest where the crown had the greatest control over the bodies of the accused. The further one moved from Philip's grip, the more fragile the accusations could appear. This did not save the order, but it complicates the legend. The Templars were not destroyed because every kingdom independently discovered the same secret evil. They were destroyed because one king moved first, moved hard, and forced the rest of Christendom to respond to a crisis already framed in his language. The papal order to arrest Templars throughout Europe widened the crisis. It gave the scandal a universal shape, even where the evidence remained local, inconsistent, or weak. Once the Pope commanded action, rulers could no longer treat the affair as merely a French dispute. The temple itself was now under suspicion everywhere. Even if brothers outside France were treated with more caution, the damage to the order's reputation had crossed borders. Reputation, once wounded at the center, bleeds outward. For ordinary Templars beyond France, the experience must have been bewildering. A brother in England or Portugal might have heard of arrests across the Channel and wondered how accusations born in French prisons had suddenly reached his own commandery. He might never have attended the rituals described in the charges. He might never have seen an idol, denied Christ, or heard of the darker claims until officials repeated them. Yet he now belonged to an institution whose name had been made dangerous. That is one of the cruel features of collective accusation. It does not ask each member to be guilty in a personal way. It makes belonging itself suspicious. A man's own conduct becomes secondary to the imagined character of the group. The mantle becomes evidence. The vow becomes evidence. The shared name becomes evidence. And in the Templar case, the name was already famous enough for the scandal to travel faster than any defense. Some rulers had reasons to resist Philip's narrative. The Templars were useful in Iberia, where military orders played an important role in frontier warfare and royal politics. In places where the order's property and personnel were tied to local defense, administration, or noble networks, destroying it outright could create practical problems. Not every king wanted French-style confiscation. Not every realm had the same relationship to papal authority. Not every population had been prepared to see the temple as a nest of heresy. Yet even skepticism could not entirely halt the process. The pressure from Rome, the force of scandal, and the difficulty of publicly defending an accused order made resistance limited. A ruler might doubt the charges, But doubt was not the same as protection. The Templars had become a liability. Their old usefulness now came wrapped in danger. To defend them too strongly was to risk appearing indifferent to heresy. To abandon them was safer. Institutions often die when defending them becomes more costly than letting them fall. This is why the wider European response is so important to the story. It shows both the weakness and the power of the accusations. Weakness, because they did not produce uniform evidence across Christendom. Power, because they did not need to. Once Philip had created the scandal, once Clement had been forced into action, once the name of the temple had been publicly stained, the question of truth became entangled with the question of political survival. The Templars outside France may have been treated less brutally, but they lived under the same collapsing roof. Even a careful inquiry could not restore the order's old innocence in the public mind. The white mantle had become too heavy with suspicion. The Red Cross no longer meant only sacrifice and courage. It now carried the shadow of the charges repeated in royal and ecclesiastical language. And in medieval Europe, language spoken by kings and popes could become reality even when reality itself remained uncertain. The Council of Vienne did not begin as a clean courtroom, where the fate of the Templars would be settled by calm evidence. It began as the final stage of a crisis already shaped by years of pressure, prison, rumor, and politics. By the time churchmen gathered to consider the order's future, the temple was alive in law but wounded in meaning. Its leaders had been imprisoned. Its brothers had been examined. Its property had been seized or guarded. Its name had been dragged through accusations so severe that even acquittal might not have restored it. That is the tragedy of reputation after scandal. Survival is not the same as recovery. The council faced a difficult question. Could the order continue after everything that had happened, even if the evidence did not prove systematic heresy, even if many charges were doubtful, even if confessions had been forced, the institution's public image had been shattered? Kings might hesitate to trust it. Donors might hesitate to support it. Popes might hesitate to defend it. The temple had become the center of a storm too large for ordinary repair. Philip wanted suppression. That much is clear. He had invested too much in the destruction of the order to accept a mild conclusion. If the council had fully cleared the Templars, Philip's own conduct would have stood exposed. The arrests, the torture, the confiscations, the public charges, all of it would have demanded explanation. A king who had claimed to purge heresy could not easily admit that he had manufactured or exaggerated it. The political cost would have been enormous, so pressure remained. Clement, caught between the weakness of the evidence and the strength of the king's will, chose a path that avoided a direct judicial condemnation of the order as heretical while still ending its existence. That distinction matters. The Templars were suppressed, not triumphantly proven guilty in the simple way Philip's propaganda might have preferred. The order was dissolved as an institution whose continuation had become impossible, dangerous, or scandalous. It was a political and administrative solution to a spiritual and legal nightmare. In 1312, the Order of the Temple was officially suppressed. With that act, nearly 2 centuries of history were brought to an end, not by a battlefield defeat, not by Muslim armies, not by the collapse of a fortress in the east, but by papal decree under royal pressure. A brotherhood born to guard pilgrims on dangerous roads died inside the machinery of European power. The irony is almost too sharp. The Templars had spent their life defending the idea of Christian unity. They were destroyed by the fractures within Christendom itself. Their enemies were not outsiders storming the walls. Their enemies were a Christian king, a pressured pope, legal officials, interrogators, and the cold force of accusation. The Holy War had turned inward. What happened to the property was another matter, and not a small one. Officially, much of the Templar wealth was meant to pass to another military order, especially the Hospitallers, so that resources dedicated to the defense of the Holy Land would remain within a similar sacred mission. That was the theory. In practice, transfer was messy. Property had been seized, claims had been made, rulers had taken custody, costs had been asserted. Assets do not move through political disaster without leaving pieces behind in powerful hands. Philip did not simply discover a treasure chest and carry it away in one night. The reality was more complicated, more bureaucratic, and perhaps more revealing. Lands, rents, buildings, and rights had to be accounted for, transferred, contested, or absorbed. The wealth of the temple was not a single pile of gold, but a network of obligations. Destroying the order meant untangling that network, while many interested parties watched closely. Still, the material incentive remained impossible to ignore. The fall of the Templars was never only about money, but it was never free of money either. The council's decision ended the institution, but it did not end the questions. Were the Templars guilty? Were they victims? Were they corrupt but not heretical? Were their rituals misunderstood, exaggerated, or abused? Did Philip believe the charges, or only find them useful? Did Clement act from cowardice, prudence, political necessity, or all of these at once? History does not hand us one simple key. It gives us a locked door with too many scratches around it. What we can say is that the suppression of the order solved the immediate political problem. Philip no longer had to coexist with a wealthy, independent military order inside his realm. Clement no longer had to defend an institution whose reputation had become poisonous. Europe no longer had to decide publicly whether the King of France had committed a massive injustice. The order was gone, and the disappearance itself became a kind of answer. But disappearance is not the same as justice. The Templars did not receive a clean restoration, nor did their accusers receive a clean vindication. The case ended in a fog. Enough accusations to stain the order forever. Enough coercion to make those accusations suspect. Enough politics to make every official decision feel compromised. That fog is why the legend survived. Certainty dies quickly when records are too neat. Mystery lives when the evidence is damaged, when power has touched every document, when the dead cannot speak except through statements written by their captors. The suppression at Vienne closed the legal life of the temple. It opened the afterlife of the Templars. From that point forward, they would belong not only to history, but to suspicion, romance, conspiracy, and myth. Their actual houses could be transferred. Their brothers could be imprisoned, released, pensioned, or condemned. Their rule could be ended. But the image of the order, wealthy, secretive, betrayed, possibly innocent, possibly dangerous, could not be suppressed by decree. The Pope could dissolve the temple. He could not dissolve the fascination it left behind. Jacques de Molay lived long enough to see the order die before he did. That may have been the cruelest punishment of all. For years after the arrests, the Grand Master remained in custody while the machinery of investigation, confession, papal hesitation, royal pressure, and institutional suppression moved around him. He was no longer the head of a living order. He was the surviving symbol of one that had been legally extinguished. That is a strange and terrible position for any leader. To remain alive after the world that gave your office meaning has been destroyed. De Molay's story is remembered most vividly because of its final turn. After earlier confessions and humiliations, after years of imprisonment, he and Geoffroy de Charnay were brought forward in 1314 to hear their sentence. The expectation may have been that they would accept perpetual imprisonment, a grim but survivable ending for men whose order was already gone. A confession, once made and maintained, could leave a path to life, however diminished. But de Molay did not follow that path. He recanted. He declared, in effect, that he had betrayed the order by confessing falsely. He denied the guilt that had been placed upon the temple. He chose, at the last possible moment, to break the script. That act changed everything. In the legal logic of the time, a man who confessed and then withdrew could be treated as relapsed. Relapse was not merely disagreement. It was spiritual stubbornness after supposed repentance. The system that had used fear to extract confession now punished courage as renewed guilt. De Molay's recantation did not reopen the case. It sealed his fate. The Grand Master was burned in Paris. So was Geoffroy de Charnay. The flames did what years of imprisonment had not fully done. They turned men into symbols. Fire has a terrifying finality, but it also creates memory. A prisoner can be hidden. A burned man in a public execution becomes an image people carry away. For Philip, the execution may have seemed necessary, perhaps even convenient. A recanting Grand Master was dangerous. If de Molay's final words spread, they could weaken the moral victory the crown had claimed. They could remind people that the confessions at the heart of the case were unstable. They could suggest that the destruction of the temple had rested on fear rather than truth. Better, from the perspective of power, to answer defiance immediately. But executions are not always obedient to the intentions of those who order them. Sometimes killing a man makes him quieter. Sometimes it makes him louder. De Molay became louder. Later generations would remember him not as a broken administrator of a failed order, but as the last Grand Master standing before death and reclaiming the innocence of the temple. Whether every detail of the final scene can be reconstructed perfectly is less important than the way the memory formed. The story needed a martyr, and de Molay's end gave it one. It also gave rise to one of the most famous legends attached to the Templars: the curse. According to later tradition, de Molay summoned Philip and Clement to judgment before God, and both men died within a year. The sequence was irresistible to memory. The king who destroyed the temple dead. The pope who suppressed it dead. The Grand Master's enemies called to account by heaven itself. It is easy to understand why people cherished the story. It gives moral shape to a world where justice had seemed absent. It suggests that if earthly courts failed, divine judgment did not. It lets the burned man speak beyond the fire. But we must handle the curse carefully. History and legend often meet at the edge of a dramatic death, and the more perfect a story feels, the more cautiously we should approach it. Did de Molay utter those exact words? Did later writers sharpen or invent them? Did coincidence become providence in the imagination of those who wanted the Templars avenged? These questions matter. Yet even if the curse is legend, the legend tells us something true about the emotional meaning of the event. People wanted the fall of the Templars to have consequences. They wanted Philip's victory to feel incomplete. They wanted the burned Grand Master to possess, at the end, a power the king could not confiscate. That power was judgment. The execution of de Molay did not restore the order. It did not return property. It did not free the dead, reverse the torture, or cleanse the records. But it transformed the ending. Without his final defiance, the Templar story might have faded more easily into legal suppression and administrative transfer. With it, the story became tragedy. A man in chains had done what the institution could no longer do. He spoke against the story imposed upon him. That is why his death remains central. Not because it solves the question of guilt, not because a final speech automatically proves innocence, but because it reveals the human cost of the entire affair. Behind the papal bulls and royal orders stood bodies. Men could be frightened into confession. Men could be trapped by their own words. Men could be burned when they tried to take those words back. The fall of the Templars was not only an institutional event. It was a series of individual endings. De Molay's was the one history remembered most. And once remembered, it began to glow with a meaning larger than the man himself. The Grand Master in flames became the last witness, the final accusation, the image of a brotherhood destroyed by power and left to survive as a question. After the flames died, the Templars did not disappear. That is the strange thing. The order was gone. Its formal structure had been suppressed. Its properties were transferred, seized, or absorbed. Its surviving members were dispersed, imprisoned, pensioned, or folded quietly into other lives. No army of Templars marched out of the shadows to reclaim Europe. No hidden fleet is securely documented carrying their treasure into the unknown. No secret government can be proven to have continued the medieval order under another name. And yet, in imagination, the Templars only grew stronger. The reason is simple. Destruction creates questions. What happened to their wealth? What happened to their documents? What did their rituals truly mean? Why did Philip strike so suddenly? Why did Clement yield? Why did confessions appear, then collapse? Why did the Grand Master die declaring the order's innocence? Every gap became a doorway. Every missing record became an invitation. Every inconsistency became the seed of legend. Over time, the Templars became attached to mysteries far beyond the original historical case. Lost treasure, hidden relics, secret knowledge, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, underground chambers, bloodlines, codes, Freemasonry, occult rites, modern conspiracies. The list is long because the Templars are useful to imagination. They sit at the perfect crossing point of religion, violence, wealth, secrecy, betrayal, and sudden destruction. Few institutions offer legend so many doors at once. This does not mean every legend deserves belief. Most do not. Many are built from fragments stretched far beyond evidence. A private initiation becomes an occult ceremony. A financial network becomes a hidden empire. A destroyed archive becomes proof of forbidden knowledge. A ruined commandery becomes the entrance to a secret vault. The less we know, the more some stories claim to explain. But the persistence of these legends is not random. The historical Templars were already unusual enough to make myth feel plausible. They were monks and warriors, poor by vow and wealthy as an institution, answerable to the Pope yet spread across kingdoms, publicly Christian yet accused of secret blasphemy, destroyed suddenly yet never fully explained. They were, in short, built for afterlife. The human mind dislikes unfinished endings. The Templar story ends with too much unresolved, damaged evidence, coerced confessions, political pressure, financial motives, papal compromise, and a leader burned after recanting. That is not a clean conclusion. It is a wound with parchment around it. Later storytellers entered that wound and filled it with meaning. Sometimes the meaning was romantic, sometimes paranoid, sometimes spiritual, sometimes commercial. But always, the Templars remained available. They could be heroes betrayed by tyranny. They could be heretics punished for secret knowledge. They could be guardians of sacred relics. They could be early bankers destroyed by debt. They could be martyrs, villains, victims, or conspirators, depending on what a later age needed them to be. That flexibility is the mark of a powerful legend. History fixes people in context. Legend frees them for reuse. The real Templars belong to the crusading world of the 12th and 13th centuries, to papal privilege, noble donation, military logistics, and medieval law. The legendary Templars belong everywhere, in novels, films, secret societies, tourist sites, internet theories, and whispered claims about hidden archives. The distance between the two is enormous, but not meaningless. Legend grows best from a historical seed that already contains tension. The Templars provided that seed. Their fall also became attached to Friday the 13th, even though the popular fear of that combined date seems to have developed much later. Still, the connection is emotionally powerful. A Friday, a 13th, a dawn raid, a betrayed brotherhood, a king in debt, a pope under pressure, a grand master burned. The ingredients are too dramatic for memory to leave alone. Whether or not medieval people saw the date as cursed in the modern sense, later generations looked backward and found the symbol waiting. The date became a container for the story. Friday the 13th did not destroy the Templars, but the Templar arrests helped give the date a darker costume in modern imagination. That is how memory works. It does not merely preserve events. It arranges them into patterns people can feel. The historian's task is not to sneer at legend, but to separate what legend reveals from what it invents. The myths around the Templars reveal a deep suspicion of power, a fascination with secrecy, and a desire to believe that institutions do not simply vanish for ordinary reasons. They also reveal discomfort with the official record. When courts, kings, and popes all appear compromised, people look for hidden explanations. Sometimes they find nonsense. Sometimes they find poetry. Sometimes they find, beneath the exaggeration, a real question that history still cannot answer cleanly. The Templars remain compelling because their fall feels both ancient and familiar. A powerful institution becomes vulnerable. A ruler needs money and control. Accusations are shaped into weapons. Confessions are extracted under pressure. Public meaning is reversed. Legal process follows political action. Property moves. Survivors are silenced. Later generations argue over what really happened. That pattern does not belong only to the Middle Ages. It belongs to power wherever power learns to dress necessity as righteousness. This may be the deepest reason the Templar legend endures, not because of treasure, not because of secret codes, not because of curses, but because the story touches something people continue to recognize. The fear that truth can be manufactured by authority, that reputation can be destroyed before defense is possible, and that once a narrative becomes useful enough, innocence may arrive too late. The fall of the Knights Templar began before sunrise, but it did not end in that morning's darkness. It continued in cells, in interrogation rooms, in papal correspondence, in council chambers, in property transfers, in flames beside the Seine, and finally, in the long afterlife of legend. The arrests of October 13th, 1307, were only the opening act. What followed was slower and more devastating. The conversion of suspicion into confession, confession into scandal, scandal into suppression, and suppression into myth. That chain is the real story. It is tempting to end with the image of hidden treasure, because treasure gives the imagination something to hold. A chest beneath stone, a map, a relic, a secret carried away before the king's men arrived. But the more unsettling possibility is that the greatest treasure was never hidden in one place. It was the network itself: land, credit, trust, mobility, reputation, independence, and the ability to connect distant parts of Christendom through vows and administration. Philip did not need to find a single legendary object. He needed to break an institution whose existence had become inconvenient. The Templars were vulnerable because they were powerful in ways that did not belong neatly to the crown. They were also vulnerable because their identity depended on trust. Once accused of betraying the cross, they had to defend not merely their conduct, but the meaning of their entire history. That is almost impossible when the accuser controls the prison, the documents, the timing, and the first public story. Their tragedy was not only that they were accused, it was that they were forced to answer after their voice as an institution had already been shattered. We should not turn them into perfect saints. The order was large, wealthy, hierarchical, and human. It surely contained ambition, arrogance, failure, and perhaps ugly customs that later defenders would prefer to ignore. But neither should we accept the darkest accusations simply because frightened men repeated them, under conditions designed to break them. The responsible position is more difficult than either romance or condemnation. It requires us to sit with uncertainty. The Templars may not have been innocent of everything, but the case that destroyed them was poisoned by politics, torture, and royal need. That distinction matters. A flawed institution can still be unjustly destroyed. A guilty individual does not prove a guilty order. A confession under agony does not become truth simply because a clerk writes it neatly. And a king's moral language does not erase the material advantage he gains from the fall of his target. These are not only medieval lessons, they are human ones. Philip IV understood something enduring about power. If you can control the first story, you can shape the battlefield on which every later argument must fight. He moved before the Templars could organize. He seized bodies and property before the Pope could fully intervene. He made the charges so horrifying that neutrality became dangerous. He turned the order's strengths, secrecy, wealth, discipline, international reach, into evidence against it. In doing so, he showed how accusation can become architecture. Build it strongly enough, and others are forced to live inside it. Clement V, for his part, shows the tragedy of authority without freedom. He held the highest spiritual office in Western Christendom, yet he moved like a man surrounded by walls. His decisions can be criticized, and should be. But they also reveal how institutions can fail when they fear the consequences of doing justice. The Pope did not create Philip's campaign, but he did not save the Templars from it. In the end, he chose suppression as the path through scandal. It ended the crisis. It did not heal it. Jacques de Molay's death gave the story its final human face. A Grand Master who had confessed, recanted, and burned became the figure through whom later generations could imagine defiance. Whether or not he cursed the king and pope in the exact words legend gives him, the moral shape of the legend is clear. The man who lost everything called his judges to a court beyond their control. That image survived because people needed it to survive. It gave the broken story a final witness. And then came the centuries. The Templars entered books, rumors, rituals, fantasies, and fears. They became less a medieval order than a mirror. People looked into them and saw what they wanted or dreaded. Secret wisdom, religious corruption, noble martyrdom, hidden wealth, state violence, forbidden power, ancient conspiracy. The real Templars could no longer correct the record. That silence made them endlessly useful. But beneath the legends, the historical core remains stark enough. On a Friday morning in 1307, a king's sealed orders opened across France. Men were arrested before they could resist. Their property was taken. Their reputation was attacked at its symbolic center. Confessions were extracted. A pope was pressured. An order was dissolved. Its last Grand Master burned. The rest is memory trying to decide what kind of story this was. Was it justice? Was it robbery? Was it a purge? Was it the exposure of corruption? Was it the destruction of an inconvenient institution by a monarch skilled in the language of righteousness? The answer may not be one thing only, but the weight of the story falls hardest on the machinery, the paperwork, the prisons, the timing, the fear, the use of accusation as a weapon. That is where the darkness lives, not in the number 13, not in superstition, not in curses whispered at the edge of flame. The true darkness is colder and more ordinary. It is the darkness of power acting before truth has room to stand. And that is why the fall of the Templars still matters, because legends may exaggerate, but they often preserve the emotional outline of a wound. The wound here is not simply that a medieval order ended. All institutions end. The wound is how it ended. Suddenly, publicly, under charges made almost impossible to answer, through a process that blurred faith, money, law, and fear until no clean separation remained. The Knights Templar began as an answer to fear on the roads to Jerusalem. They ended as prisoners of fear in the Kingdom of France. Between those 2 points lies the rise and fall of one of the most fascinating brotherhoods in medieval history. And after all the myths are stripped away, the final lesson may be simpler than the legends suggest. A reputation built over centuries can be destroyed in a morning. A confession can be forced into existence. A sacred symbol can be turned against those who wear it. And sometimes, the most dangerous weapon in a kingdom is not the sword. It is the sealed order waiting for dawn.